There's a very specific kind of denial that only shows up in families, usually around a holiday dinner, when somebody's cousin has clearly wrecked the car and is standing in the driveway insisting the dent was always there. Everyone at the table knows better. Nobody says anything because it's Thanksgiving and there's pie, and confrontation ruins gravy. Hi, by the way, good to have you here. I mentioned the cousin in the car because this week the United States government performed roughly that exact scene on a much bigger stage, with considerably higher stakes than a Honda Civic. And I want to walk you through it because the dent in this case is the country's credibility, and nobody's bringing pie. Start with the one that actually gets people killed. The ceasefire with Iran, the one brokered back in the spring, the one everyone agreed to stand down from, is over, not quietly over. Announced in all caps on a phone at 10:30 in the morning over. The president posted that Iran had asked to continue talks, that the United States agreed to that, and then added, and I'm trimming this down to the essential part, that the ceasefire was over, exclamation point. Iranian officials, for their part, say they never asked for anything of the sort and remain deeply distrustful of Washington. So, you have two governments, both nuclear adjacent, both currently trading airstrikes near one of the most important oil choke points on the planet, and neither one can agree on who called whom. That is not a diplomatic nuance. That is the plot of a divorce nobody wants to finalize, playing out through a shipping lane that carries a fifth of the world's oil. And here is the part that should actually concern an American watching this from, say, Ohio, rather than a briefing room in the Gulf. This war keeps getting declared over and then keeps not being over, on a schedule that appears to track the president's mood roughly as closely as it tracks the actual battlefield. Strikes hit ports, drone depots, a railway bridge 700 miles from the strait everyone claims to care about. Oil markets flinch every time, and the bill for all of that. The fuel prices, the shipping insurance premiums, the military tempo, gets paid by the same public that was told, back in the spring, that this thing was handled. Which brings us, conveniently, to the alliance that's supposed to keep America's adversaries in check, because that one had a rough week too. At the NATO summit in Turkey, a Danish reporter did something almost nobody in Washington has done in about a decade. He asked the alliance's own Secretary General, to his face, whether flattering the American president while he threatens to annex an ally's territory was doing anything to his self-respect. Mark Rutte's answer, more or less, was that he prefers to give credit where credit's due, and that American pressure has made European defense spending stronger, which is a lovely answer to a question nobody asked. The reporter didn't ask if defense spending had gone up. He asked what it costs a person, internally, to sit next to threats against Greenland and Spain and say nothing. And I think the answer, delivered entirely without irony, is that it costs quite a lot, actually. You just have to be extremely disciplined about not noticing. Now, why should an American care what a Dutch former prime minister feels about himself? Because the entire architecture of U.S. alliances runs on the assumption that partners trust Washington enough to keep hedging their bets in America's direction rather than someone else's. And trust, once it starts requiring this much active management, this much flattery, this much looking the other way, isn't really trust anymore. It's maintenance. And maintenance is expensive, and it is usually the first thing that quietly stops being worth it. Meanwhile, back home, a much smaller but somehow much pettier fight reached its own verdict. A federal appeals court told the administration, for the second time, that the president's name is not going back on the Kennedy Center. The court found, and this is the part I actually enjoy, that the government couldn't produce anything resembling evidence that removing a name from a building was causing anyone irreparable harm, which, if you think about it for longer than 5 seconds, is a fairly obvious thing to fail to prove, because a name is not load-bearing. Congresswoman Joyce Beatty, who brought the original lawsuit, said the ruling confirmed the renaming had been unlawful from the start and that it's time to take the tarps down. The tarps, for context, are still up. They've been up for weeks. Scaffolding still covers the columns. So, you have simultaneously a war that won't stay ceased and a construction project that won't finish. And if you squint, both of them are actually the same story. An administration that is extremely good at announcing things and considerably less good at the part where the thing actually happens. Which brings us to the number I think matters most this week, because it's the one with the smallest headline and the largest price tag. A watchdog analysis found that the deferred resignation program, the one that let nearly 140,000 federal employees stay home on full pay for months while technically resigning, has cost taxpayers somewhere between $11 and $15 billion so far. Not $15 billion in severance for people who left. $15 billion, give or take, for people who stayed on the payroll and did not work. At least 10 agencies had to go rehire staff they'd just paid to leave, because it turned out those staff were doing things the government actually needed, which, again, is the kind of discovery you'd hope to make before the layoffs rather than several months and several billion dollars afterward. One researcher who worked on the analysis put it about as plainly as a policy report ever puts anything. He called the effort stupid, costly, and deadly. I don't think I can improve on that sentence, so I won't try. Here's what ties all four of these together. And it isn't ideology, and it isn't even really about one man, though it's very tempting to make it about one man. It's that every one of these stories, the ceasefire, the alliance, the building, the payroll, is a story about the gap between what gets announced and what gets delivered, and about who ends up covering that gap. It's never the person who made the announcement. It's the sailor near the Strait of Hormuz. It's the small European country wondering if Washington still has its back. It's the taxpayer who just found out the government paid $15 billion for absence. The pattern isn't chaos for its own sake. Chaos, it turns out, has a very specific business model. Someone else always ends up holding the invoice. And maybe that's the actual headline this week, buried under four separate ones. Not that the ceasefire collapsed, or that a diplomat had an awkward moment at a podium, or that a building kept its original name, or that a spreadsheet somewhere finally added up to $15 billion. The headline is that all four of those things happened in the same 7 days, to the same country. And by Monday morning, it'll already feel like old news, which, if you think about it, is genuinely the most impressive part of the whole operation. Not the war, not the money, the pace. I'm Marcus Fenn. This is Borderlines. We'll see what next week decides to cost.